today to our, I just have to look at the sheet. I can't believe it's our 9th just an hour conversation today. As you know, we're fortunate to have Philip Tarrant, is that how you pronounce your last name? Who's going to be talking with us. Thanks. About the proposed ABOR policy on data management and access for data used in research across faculty and student research. Usually before we start, we'd make some announcements, so I'll kick us off with that. Those of you who were at the all-college meeting this morning, some of this will be, a reminder based on announcements made then. One thing, just to follow up what Avetta said, just a reminder that the week of November 14th to 18th is International Education Week. And so stay tuned. We're going to have a variety of different kinds of conversations and events during that week. One just to point out, on November 15th is a conversation sponsored by one of our Learning Futures collaboratives. The topic being socio-emotional living and well-being, cornerstones of refugee immigrant education. That's from 9 to 10 a.m. on November 15th. I don't know, maybe Clarin or someone, if you've got the Zoom link, you could put that in the chat. Also that week, November 16th, unrelated to international education, we're holding a session at 12 noon on promotion to full professor. And Audrey Beardsley and Ron Beghetto, who've served on the University Promotion and Tenure Committee, are going to share what we think are some really helpful perspectives on how the university committee functions and what they're looking for when they review those cases. Also in November, on November 28th, that's a Monday at 12 noon, we'll be, the college is hosting a book conversation with Amanda Ticini, whose book, Native Presence and Sovereignty in, I've got this cut off here, in college and universities. She'll be hosting a conversation organized in a session by Cristobal Rodriguez. So look for more information about that, including a Zoom link. Just a reminder to follow us at ASU Education on Twitter, where we're really trying to promote faculty work, and a reminder to look for our monthly survey. Please complete that so we know more about the work that you're all doing. And just a reminder, we'll reiterate this at the end. Next Friday is Veterans Day. We'll not be having a just an hour. And on November 18th, we'll be having a session that will be led by the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College Office of Global Engagement in celebration of Global Education Week. So look for more specifics about that coming up, and that will be our last just an hour for the fall semester. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Punya, to introduce our guest and the topic for today. So
thank you, Betty. As all of you know, you've received emails from us about this new policy, which is sort of part of ASU's commitment to ensuring that we develop a culture of open science and scholarship. We're very grateful, Philip, to join us today to discuss the sort of draft policy document which we have shared with you. And many of you reached out to us wanting to better understand this document, its provenance, its implications for the work that we do as scholars and researchers. So thank you for that. And thank you for those who took time to fill out the feedback survey. So today's session is devoted to this document. And Philip Tarrant, who is a Research Data Management Officer in the Research Technology Office at Knowledge Enterprise, and also a senior global feature scientist. I'm so grateful for his joining us. And I think, Phil, the structure of the conversation, I think we can keep it very simple. Maybe start with you to give us some context and background about how this came to be, and then we can open it up for Q&A with people. And we have a couple of questions that we can ask, though I don't think our faculty and students are sort of the shy retiring types. I think they will have questions that they will put up there. So Philip, I'm just going to pass it on to you because we have just an hour to do this.
Sure, and if it's okay, I will actually share just a few slides to help guide that conversation, because I do think putting this in context is helpful.
It's probably more than I've seen in a long time, but I don't know about you guys.
Nicole, are you talking about like mental health spiraling?
Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you please mute those? Okay, thank you. All right. So,
Okay. Can you see that slide, maroon with gold on the front? This is just a brief introduction. I mean, we're looking at the research life cycle, the idea that we all, in doing our research, we come up with an idea, we want to submit a proposal, we conduct our research, and we you know, close that out and move on to new things. But just to put that in the context of research data management, you know, in this day and age, data is a part of that, and digital data is a part of that. And it's a subset of that process. And potentially we start creating the data even before we submit the grant sometimes, because we're trying to create some small proof of concept that will support the grant submission. So one of the things that has happened over the last few years is that particularly via the federal funding agencies, there's been this rising expectation that the results of research will be made more readily accessible to a broader audience. And one of the things that triggered that in the early days was there was an Office of Science and Technology policy memo that came out that said basically any federal agency that had more than $100 million in funding should make plans to manage those data and to make those data more broadly accessible. That was followed on by various journals. For instance, in 2016, Science and Nature basically adopted a data policy that said they would expect data to be deposited somewhere where they were accessible prior to publication of articles. And then in 2020, the NIH issued a policy on data sharing that was going to take effect, or is going to take effect, in January 2023. And most recently, that was followed by another OSTP memo, which basically came out in August, talking about the fact that open science is required, public access is required, and therefore everybody should be working towards that goal. And just to underline that, ASU has not been asleep during this period. We have actually been trying to move the needle forward with respect to research data management. And in response to the original OSTP memo, we ran a tri-university project for a couple of years called Live Data, where we worked with NAU and U of A in order to think about how we can do this better as a university system rather than trying to solve the same problem individually. That you know, persisted over time. Although the project ended, the dialogue continued. In 2019, I was asked to take on the role of Research Data Management Officer for Knowledge Enterprise. And in 2021, I was able to hire some research data managers, which are physical human resources we have, to assist us with some of these tasks. So just to put that in context, when we talk about in excess of $100 million, the 2013 numbers are on the left column and the 2021 numbers are in the right column. But as you can see, this affects a lot of federal funding. You know, everybody from the usual suspects, the National Science Foundation, NIH, NASA, the Department of Education, and so on and so forth down the list. So there's a large number of federal funding agencies that were affected by this expectation. So a couple of years ago, we started talking again with our colleagues at NAU and U of A about the need for us to, you know, treat this as a more institutional approach. It's very challenging to ask individual units to actually take account of all this, and it does make sense for us as an institution and even as a tri-university system to try and put in place tools and systems and things that will actually accommodate these requirements. And so we started off as a working group with doing some research. We looked at a number of universities and research institutions that actually already had data management policies. Those were institutions like Columbia, Cornell, Iowa State, Utah State, and several others. And we pulled out the, you know, what we thought were the best components of each of those. And then we actually went one step further. and added some extra things, which we figured would allow us to compare ourselves more favorably with just a very basic policy. And we produced the drafts that you have all been exposed to now. You've all seen that. I have to say it took us longer to engage with our leadership and with ABOR than I would have liked, because that draft was produced last year. But we finally got the attention that we needed in order for us to be able to share this with you and to socialize it and seek some feedback. And then the goal ultimately, obviously incorporating that feedback into the policy, is to actually implement it. But underlying that is the need to implement the processes and the infrastructure that will actually make it happen. Because this is not the intention that all of a sudden you just have an extra burden, you know, because we know the faculty have enough burdens, administrative and related to the work that they do. So, you know, in parallel with that, we've been very keen to think about what is the infrastructure that's needed, what processes do we need, what tools do we need in order to help people to do this effectively. And so we've been working on that in parallel with drafting the policy. So as I mentioned earlier, I was asked to take on the role of Research Data Management Officer. I was then asked to create a Research Data Management Office, which we have. That's nominally a team of 4 people, including myself. Although we are down 1 person at the moment and we're going through a hiring cycle. The library, for their part, and one of the first things we did with the library and Knowledge Enterprise was we set up a formal partnership with them, because we knew that in order to support this total research data life cycle, we needed to have mechanisms for handing off research data to the library, potentially for publication or to support publication efforts. So they have set up an Open Science and Scholarly Communications department, which is an extension of what they had previously. We have multiple storage solutions on campus for managing data effectively, and we wanted to make sure that we have the appropriate solutions to manage every type of research data that we have, because I'll be frank with you, we didn't prior to earlier this year. There were some areas where we have research data that probably is in places where it shouldn't be, ideally from a security and privacy perspective. The university, Knowledge Enterprise, invested in an electronic lab notebook. I prefer to call it an electronic research notebook. It's actually a web-based tool that can be used in and out of the laboratory for all sorts of different types of research, and is a mechanism for people to be able to keep track of what they do. You can document your methods in there, you can document meeting notes, you can create links to your data and things like that. And the whole goal of that is the idea to document things as you go along, so that when you do get to the end of a research project and potentially you might want to make some of the data accessible and publish those as part of your journal publication cycle, that information is already there, ready for you to do that, to create the metadata that's necessary so that somebody else can interpret the data. The other thing was that we had 3 implementations of REDCap, which is a human subject survey tool on campus. They were all hosted at the unit level. And so we made the decision to invest in an enterprise support for that. And Knowledge Enterprise now hosts 2 versions of REDCap. One is for general human subject survey activity, and the other one is for HIPAA-related survey activity, which basically has additional controls on it to restrict data being removed from the system. The other thing was that our colleagues in the College of Health Solutions were running an honest broker service, which is a basis on which data could be requested from the Department of Health. We also made the decision to make that an enterprise-wide service. That is now within Knowledge Enterprise, and it actually sits within my office. I'm responsible for it. And basically any researcher that wants to conduct research that requires some kind of public health data can submit that request through the honest broker, and we will triage that request, make sure that all the documentation is there, the IRB approvals and so on. And then we will submit that to the Arizona Department of Health, and we will then work with them to make sure that that gets approved, and then we will package the data and supply it into an appropriate environment for the researcher. The other thing that we set up, which was being done potentially at the unit level, was we wanted to take account for secure research needs. And so Knowledge Enterprise invested, or the university invested, in what we call the Arizona Secure Research Environment. This is a very secure research computing environment that is actually not even on campus. It's at a secure computing data center in Phoenix, and it's highly tenanted virtual machines that are highly partitioned so that any data that's being processed is only accessible by the appropriate people. And researchers working with sensitive data needs, whether that's human subjects, health, etc., can have computing capacity in that space and know that those data are protected and that in fact they can't be removed from that environment without administrative support from the technical staff. Therefore, there's a check and balance in terms of what goes in and what comes out. You may also be aware that ASU made a very significant investment in supercomputing. It was over $10 million. That supercomputer is now live. It's the son of Agave, we call it Sol, and that is being commissioned. It's not fully functional, partly because of supply chain challenges. But the interesting thing about that, and I certainly from my perspective, is that having made that investment, if somebody then came back to me as part of the university leadership and said, well, we know you just spent $10 million on a new supercomputer, but we actually need a secure high performance computing cluster, I would have said, well, didn't we just spend all that money on a supercomputer? Why do we need to spend more? But they didn't say that, because we did go and make that ask earlier this year, and the university came back and invested another $1.2 million in a high performance computing cluster, which will go into ASRE, our secure research environment. That has already, some parts of that have already arrived on site, and our plan is to commission that before the end of the year. So the university is making significant investments in terms of making sure we have the infrastructure that we need to do what we're proposing to do. In addition to that, we also made an ask of the provost and the EVPR, Sally Morton and Nancy, earlier this year, to follow up on a Senate request, a faculty Senate request, which was to create some kind of open access publishing fund. And this was particularly with in mind researchers that maybe don't have access to larger grants, or early career researchers that are trying to publish their research into an open access environment. The request from the Faculty Senate, I think, was for $30,000 for this fund to get it started. We actually proposed a pilot to run that for a year, and the EVPR and Provost came back and actually said, well, let's set it up for 3 years and see how it goes. So we were actually allocated $30,000 a year for the next 3 years in order to do that. And obviously that may be a drop in the ocean when it comes to open access publishing, but at least we've put a stake in the ground. The other thing is we do have an institutional data repository. So for anybody who ultimately wants to publish their data, a lot of researchers will typically put those data into a discipline themed repository, something that's, if you're an environmental scientist, it might be a repository aimed at that. If you're a social scientist, it might be the IPCSR up at Michigan. But the university does also have an institutional data repository. So there's a backstop there. If you're not at all sure where you would like to publish your data, there will always be a repository at ASU that will provide you with long-term security for the data, provide a discoverable metadata record and a digital object identifier which is persistent and can be included into publications. And then the other thing that I'm always keen to do is to promote ORCID, which is, if you like, your social security number for research. ORCID provides a system of record for actually documenting everything you do as a researcher. And that system actually interacts with lots of other systems. It interacts with our faculty activity reporting system. It interacts with federal funding grant submission systems. And there are various things that you can do with your system of record, like create your CV as part of a proposal submission very easily. And I've done that myself and can speak to the fact that it is very straightforward to do. And then finally, the DMP tool is something that's run by the California Digital Libraries, and that's intended to assist people with creating a data management plan, and comes along with various templates and things like that, so that a researcher who needs to create a data management plan as part of a proposal can do that in the format that the submitting agency expects. The DMP tool that we have access to is single sign-on. So if you want to make use of it as part of a proposal preparation, you don't need to create a new account. You just go to it and you can log in, and it will use your ASU credentials to log you in. And in addition to that, there's guidance information in there that is specific. Some of it is specific to the agency you may be submitting to, depending on the template, but we also have ASU specific information in that tool that will guide you if you need to reach out for additional help from colleagues at ASU. And then I think it's always worth mentioning that, you know, we can't boil the ocean on our own, and that is that, you know, this is a large task that we're trying to undertake. And so Knowledge Enterprise has a large number of resources available to you as researchers, but also there are other units around campus that maintain departments and teams of people to support their own researchers, all of whom are usually willing to provide support to other grants if the funding is available to do that. You know, we have access to scientific programming resources. The School of Geography has a GIS lab that will create a GIS application for you if you wanted one as part of your, you know, your outputs from your project. The CHS, the College of Health Solutions, and the Biodesign Institute both have biostatistics or bioinformatics teams that can provide support. And what is not that well known is that the library has a modeling and visualization team that actually can provide assistance as well. So there's lots of resources around to help. And in addition to that, we're trying to develop self-service tools as well that will actually allow people, and this is one that's an example, we're trying to develop more of these. You know, if you need to conduct some research and you're not quite sure what's an appropriate storage solution for you, and sadly, in some respects, we have a multitude of storage solutions, which does create some level of confusion. But you can go to this tool, you can answer a few questions, and it will narrow down your options as to those which are approved for the type of data that you expect to collect. And there are some other links here, and I do have these slides as a PDF, Punya, so I'll send these to you and you can distribute them to your colleagues. But I just wanted to use that to kind of set the scene in terms of what we're trying to do and why we want to, you know, create a process and infrastructure that will support the policy. So we're not just throwing the policy over the fence and asking you as colleagues to actually, you know, take on this extra administrative burden. Our goal is to provide you with the support that you need in order to do it. Now, some of that support comes for free. For instance, my group, if anybody needs to write a data management plan, they can reach out via our website and put in a request, and we will contact you and we will help you draft something. So some of those resources are available free of charge. Obviously, if you wanted a research data manager to provide half their time managing your research database for a study that you have, that's something that we would need to budget for in a grant. But generally, there is an awful lot of support available to the faculty and readily available to the faculty without any charge at all to support your activities. So that's my pitch. I'm very happy to hand off to you now, and you can ask me any questions you like, and I'll do my best to respond.
Thank you, Philip. So I'm going to start. I'm going to ask one question, then open it up to everybody, because I think it's one thing to talk about these things in the abstract. So I'm going to give you a hypothetical scenario, and if you could sort of just talk through what that would mean. So I'm thinking of a doctoral student who is intending to do some, let's say, observational research in a K-12 classroom with at-risk students. And it is a qualitative study with some video observations. It's under the advising of a faculty member, but this is a student-led study and they're sort of in the third or fourth year or whatever. What would this policy mean sort of step by step for the faculty and the doctoral student, right? So for instance, when it comes to IRB, we now know what those steps are. You do X, you do Y, you know, there is a process there. So what would this mean from when an idea becomes, comes in your mind about a study to sort of the final publication and then the data and all of that? Could you just talk through that a little bit?
Yeah. And let me start by saying, because human subjects research, obviously, I mean, I am a technologist by background and a conservation biologist. My study subject, when I was able, I don't have time these days, but when I was able to do active research, was actually birds of prey. So, there's not a lot of privacy issues associated with birds of prey, but I am a HIPAA privacy officer for our secure research environment. And I do understand, the additional restrictions associated with human subjects research. And the long-term ecological research project that I used to be involved with as the information manager, we did do social science work as well, surveying and things like that. And so we did have to deal with the challenge of privacy and the data that's associated with it. So to first of all say that when it comes to human subjects research, the policy does allow for the fact that you may not be able to publish the results. You may not be able to publish the data. If you've collected video, for instance, you may not be able to make that readily accessible. So the policy does account for that. But I don't think that that's something that we should automatically say lets us off the hook of trying to make the results and the data associated with our research accessible, if at all possible. So I think with respect to your particular example, I would hope that, and we do this already, that a doctoral student could quite easily come to our team and seek advice in terms of how to manage the data associated with that, where to store the data if that was something they weren't sure of. Their faculty advisor, I would hope, would be able to guide them towards us. And as I say, we're very happy to respond to students as easily as we are to any other researcher at the university. And I think we would be able to give them guidance as to good ways to manage the data, the potential for structurally processing the data, because I think one thing that it's worth to note is that there is data that you can put in a spreadsheet and you can run a couple of formulas and you'll get an outcome, you'll get a result that might be sufficient for your needs. But we have been teaching a research data management graduate class for the last few years through the School of Sustainability, where we talk about more the idea of scientific workflows and things like that. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply significantly to qualitative data, but the idea is that there are certain disciplines that you can undertake in terms of managing your data to make sure that when you get to the end of your study, you know how you created them, you know the methods that were used to create them, you have a reasonable level of documentation so you can document the outcome in the same way that you would want to create some of that information and put it into a research publication. So I certainly think we can provide support to our doctoral students. And my suggestion would be with respect to this example is you're not in this on your own. So as a faculty advisor, if you don't think research data management is your strong point, then you just advise the student to reach out to our central support environment and we will provide that support for them. And we're in a situation where we're looking at moving a little bit away from the academic class. The research data management class we ran was actually an academic class with a line number, but we're looking at running more in the shape of workshops that the students can attend and faculty if they want to. And they would act as building blocks that would slowly build up people's experience in the space of research data management.
I have lots of questions, but I think it's more important that we get our faculty and doctoral students here.
Yeah.
And I think the main point I want to emphasize in the conversation that we have had is just the variety and richness of the work that happens within a college and the diversity of it. And I think some of the concerns and challenges or frustrations or whatever the right word may be is sort of emerging from that. But I'm just going to leave open the floor. Feel free to just jump in and ask questions of Philip, because I think this is going to have impact on almost every aspect of research that we do. And as an R1 institution, this is incredibly important that we have a better understanding of this and inform the design of this policy. So please, anybody.
I'm curious about IRB and the subjects themselves. Whenever we perform an initial research study, subjects have the opportunity to opt out at any time in that study if they feel that they or a group is going to be harmed from that. What kind of protections do we have for the use of secondary? It's my understanding there's no continuation of an IRB process or anything along those lines. So what happens when it comes to the subject's ability to opt out of secondary research, or can they?
Sure, and that's a great question. I mean, as far as this policy is concerned, the policy is one thing. The implementation and the way in which we manage the policy is something which has been delegated in the policy down to the institutional level. So, for instance, my team already works very closely with IRB, and not only just IRB, but the contracts and negotiations team with respect to data use agreements. And my expectation is we would continue to do that. And one of the reasons I was very happy to attend the meeting today and to hear from you is I absolutely want to understand what the implications of this are, because this is such a large, diverse university that I don't know all the research that's going on. I mean, I love hearing about people's research because it is so diverse and interesting. So I think the way in which we accommodate the policy within our processes is that some of our processes will have to change. And particularly when it comes to human studies, I'll give you some anecdotal evidence. Is we recently had a situation where a researcher at ASU was not allowed to take their research data to another institution because the consent form did not allow for it, the way in which it had been worded. And so one of the things that I'm very keen to do, and I'm working with the Red Cap group because a lot of the human subject studies go through there and they include the consent forms, is to understand how can we produce consent forms that protect the participant, but also, allow us to use the data responsibly. And I don't think we're there yet. I think I think there's a lot more we could do with our consent forms that would actually allow us to create a more integrated workflow where we do understand when these data were collected, because that's the kind of thing we don't know at the moment. If somebody collects those data and downloads them onto a flash drive today and takes them somewhere else, we don't necessarily know that. I wish we did, not because I want to restrict what people do, but just because we do have this responsibility to protect the study participants. So, Mark, I don't actually have an answer for your question right now, but I do recognize it's something we've got to pay attention to as we implement the policy.
Thank you.
I kind of have a dovetail question to that a little bit. What will the hierarchy be? So this policy, will it be the standing policy and then exceptions can be made on a case-by-case basis through maybe ORSPA, the pre-award process? Because I'm thinking about, we have a couple of centers in our college and many PIs that have commission studies and research. And often that might be funded by a philanthropic organization who has a very different criteria for even F&A, but how that the data is stored, they may have their own platform. It might be a private study just for the organization, like some of our local Arizona Community Foundation, those types of organizations. Is it going to be a case-by-case exception, or will the clause kind of be, here's the standing policy unless the sponsor states otherwise, which is how most of our policies are?
Yeah, and thank you for the question, Juliana. Yes, I mean, basically, and I'll give you a little bit of additional context, I guess, because somebody asked me this morning about the fact that this policy actually is a little bit broader than the NIH policy, which is referenced in the survey request. And one of the reasons we took that position to be more comprehensive was twofold. One is that we believe ASU has the potential to be an exemplar in this space. We know our president has actually publicly stated that science should be more open and accessible to people. So we kind of have that moral responsibility, I guess. But the second thing is that we figured with the policy better to aim high and potentially have to trim things back a little bit via the implementation of the policy than to just aim low and come out with a policy that really doesn't achieve the goal. So I don't know that necessarily the policy as you've seen it, because it is a draft, will be the final version of the policy. but I do know that we are aware of the requirements to create the processes and infrastructure necessary to manage it. So we are aiming for something that's fairly general, but the policy in the I'm trying to think which the specific title of the section, in the data access and availability section, it does actually say that any prior requirements that are laid off on the researcher supersede this policy. So if there is a contractual restriction, then it supersedes this policy, and the policy explicitly states that. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that I kind of see this policy as a line in the sand. I don't really expect anybody to go back into the cupboard in their office and dig out the floppy drive and start publishing data sets that they created 20 years ago. That's not a realistic expectation. I mentioned to someone this morning, I have 2 databases from my own research, and they're labeled database A and database B. And I didn't collect enough documentation to know why they're different. I don't know if one's a backup of the other or whether they are actually different. So I've experienced that situation myself. So I do see this as something we're going to try and build on for proposals and submissions and grants going forward. And I think if we have an explicit policy in place, then it informs the discussions we have with the agencies that do provide funding. You know, if it is a philanthropic organization, we can say, this is what we aspire to do. Is that something you're comfortable with? And if they're not, then as I say, the contract and the associated with the grant and the research supersedes this policy. So this is not an overrider by any means. It's aspirational. I mean, we may find it's a challenge for us to do some of the things that the policy says we will do. But I don't see why we wouldn't try. And I believe ASU is so innovative in so many different ways. I know we've all heard it before, you know, for the 8th year in a row. But the reality of it is you know, we are a large organization, and we do have a good group of creative people who can help us do some of these things and implement some of these things. And we're a large enough institution to justify the investment. You know, if this was a small university, this policy would be a real challenge. And by the way, to put that in context, I mentioned the Honest Broker service that we provide, where we provide researchers access to Department of Health data. We are doing that for NAU because NAU does not have the resources to do that themselves. So we are also talking to NAU about our institutional repository being their institutional repository, because again, they don't have the resources to do that themselves. So I do acknowledge that a small institution would have trouble implementing this policy on their own.
Thank you, Philip. I'm going to take a question from somebody who had emailed this to us from one of our faculty members.
Sure.
This is an important issue, so I'm going to read out what they have written. So, what the point that they were making was that this policy right now does not make clear what interim work products are included. So for instance, they say that most research includes a variety of analysis that never make it to publication because there are errors in the analysis or there are better choices. So their worry is that read too broadly this policy would require retention, organization, and publication of every research dead end that happened in a project. For instance, versions of statistical coding where they have syntactical errors. So they feel that requiring researchers to preserve the complete version of all of this code, you know, even qualitative coding or badly formatted figures would be an unreasonable burden and does not really meet the spirit of the new federal rules. So do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I mean, realistically, there's a data packet which is the final version. You know, it was what was successful in terms of creating the output. You know, if you used a computer model to run simulations, you know, we don't need the alpha version, the beta version, and the version 1.0. You know, we're interested in the result and the outputs and the materials that we used to create the final version of the research. And I think that's very reasonable for that to be the goal. You know, we're not asking everybody to preserve absolutely everything they did. I mean, one of the things that we teach in our research data management class is that if you're going to process the data programmatically, then you actually never change the source data. each stage in your scientific workflow processes the data and produces an output, and the next stage works on that output and keeps going, which means you can then go back and fix any errors in your workflow without corrupting the original data. And so, you know, there's various ways you can do that. Well, obviously, the one we'd be interested in is that final version of that workflow that takes the source data and processes it and turns it out into a final product. So, yeah, your interim products in that sense, you know, would not include all the failures that go along with that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful, because I think that was a big concern, that somehow the idea was that you would be like sort of putting into the system every piece of data as it happened and the analysis that happened. And I can see how that could be a significant burden on anybody.
Absolutely. No, I agree with that. And this is one of the reasons I think it's worth us considering taking advantage of things like our electronic research notebook, because you can annotate that. You know, you can run an experiment and then say, oh, that failed. And you just make a note of that in the notebook. And you don't ultimately publish the data set that was your failure data set, but you do have a complete record of everything that you did to achieve your successful outcome. And, you know, so I think documenting the way we do things will change over time and allow us to track our success and failures without necessarily having to publish our success and failures, just the successes.
Okay. Anyway, any other questions?
I saw a question in the chat about the open access publishing fund. Yes, I think what happened, we got approval to do this, and I think the provost intended to announce that to the faculty senate at the meeting. I'm not sure if it was the February or the March meeting, but as you all know, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that meeting took on a very different tone to what was expected. So the announcement, the official announcement, hasn't happened as far as I'm aware. But basically, the commitment was to make available to the library a sum each year, and I think the idea was that the faculty senate would create some kind of review committee that would take the requests in, because we probably won't have enough money to satisfy all the requests, and basically to just assess them as they come in and to allocate the funding that's there. That's about as much as I can tell you about it at the moment. As I say, I think the idea of building that process out was significantly delayed just because of what happened earlier on this year. And also, it's the library, it's not me, I'm afraid. I don't control that effort, but I do know that my colleague in the library, which is Annalie Perry, if you are interested, reach out to Annalie. She can tell you where it currently stands. As I say, I think they're still developing the underlying process, but the expectation is a request would be reviewed by somebody, and then the funding would be allocated and made available. What else can I answer?
There's a comment here from iPhone 2. I don't know who that is. Do they want to speak up? They can speak up, or I can read their comment out.
Sure, I can take a look at it here, the data. Yeah, and I think that's a good point with respect to reproducibility or replicability. One of the things that we're trying to do with respect to our health research is one of the things we have to commit to the Department of Health is when a particular study is complete, the data that we supplied on behalf of ADHS will be destroyed. Now, we actually hold a certain amount of ADHS data in our secure data warehouse, but basically the data that was supplied to the researcher, they have to attest that they've destroyed it. Now, one of the things that we've said with respect to that is, in order to support reproducibility, it's fine for us to destroy the data, but what we should try and preserve are any workflows or any scripts that were used to actually create the final outcome. Because if we do that, we can always go back to the ADHS at a later date and request exactly the same data that was requested the first time, and theoretically at least bring that refreshed data set back in, rerun the analysis, and ultimately produce the same results. So keeping any workflows or anything like that, even if there's a commitment to destroy the data set, at least would allow people to analyze the process that was gone through to create the final results.
Anybody, questions?
As I say, I think the key part of this exercise will be how, as an institution, we implement the policy, and that is delegated down to us as an institution. And I think it serves us in two ways. One is, obviously, we've tried to within reason, because I mean, it has to be a general to some degree because it's supposed to apply to all three universities. So, you know, there's no point in mentioning knowledge enterprise in the policy because U of A doesn't have a knowledge enterprise, you know, and so on and so forth. But I think there's two things. One is the policy now gives some explicit guidance to researchers in the way that our intellectual property policy does, in terms of, you know, what the university might expect from you as a researcher with respect to your data management. But the other thing it does, which I don't tend to talk about so much because I think it's something that will show itself as we go through time, is that it actually places a responsibility on the institution to put in place the infrastructure and processes necessary to allow you to do this. And as I say, the reason I'm not shouting that quite as loudly is because I don't want anybody further up the institution to get nervous about the fact we're going to come and ask for a lot more money. But, you know, the reality of it is, if we are going to, you know, meet this policy as an institution, then the institution has a responsibility as well as us as researchers.
Right. I think that was one of the things that did come up in some of our discussions, which is the level of security in terms of like computational that it requires would be quite a burden on individual colleges. And, you know, if we had to add that layer to it. The other piece that sort of emerged was, you know, IRB, you know, when we go for an IRB, there are that you'll keep the data securely for so many years and so on. And at some points in the policy document, those numbers don't match up. So I wonder if that's been something that has been brought to your attention, because I think in this document, sometimes it's at 7 years. Well, I think IRB has sort of different ones. And I wonder if that has been discussed.
Yeah, and it does allow for it in the policy. I think the number that was entered into the policy, again, was, you know, an aspirational number, but it basically says there's a rider there in the policy. I'm not sure if I can find it live while we're on here, but it does say basically that retention period or whatever is expected by the agency that provided the funding. So it's not a rock solid, you have to keep it for the number of years set in this policy. And we've tried very hard in the policy to say, what's good guidance, and then we recognize that guidance may not be applicable to you as a researcher, and therefore there's the caveat that says under certain circumstances this guidance is not relevant. And we have tried to do that in the policy. And if we've missed that anywhere, then, you know, obviously we'll try and catch that as part of the comments and the revisions that we make before we try and implement the policy.
Yeah, so one area that a faculty member pointed out to us is that, you know, there are exemptions in the policy for you know, student work and credit-bearing coursework.
Mm-hmm.
They pointed out there are many instances where, particularly in doctoral dissertation, that students might not be, you know, they might still be working on the dissertation, but they don't need to be registered. And
right.
so something needs to be there in the language there which covers that. Otherwise, that would be, you know, a problem because, you know, might defend their proposal and then not sign up for any doctoral credits because they're going to just work on it, and then they'll go and sign up the semester that they plan to graduate. But then they're not covered by the policy in that time when they're not registered, right?
Okay.
So there are going to be these. I mean, I think that's where I think that it's going to get tricky as Philip, you and your team move forward. There are going to be so many of these like little exceptions that will pop up. And I just thinking of the variety of research that is done within our college. And then I'm thinking of whether it's Watts or other places who are working with populations which are, you know, with whom you have to have their own specific IRBs. Like I'm thinking, you know, so I think there are going to be lots of these little exceptions. But what I'm pleased to hear, Philip, from you is that I think part of the concern that our faculty had was that this policy is going to come down hard, you know, starting January 1, and there are no exceptions. What I'm hearing you say is that we are exploring that this is an aspirational thing. This is where we need to be, but there are going to be lots of there's going to be a lot of learning along the way as we do this. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, and I think, you know, a good example of that would be the university has 4 data classifications that are historical and legacy. I think there's public, private, sensitive, and highly sensitive, something like that. If you actually look at those classifications, they don't mention research at all. They're all about student data, payroll, human resources, social security numbers, student numbers, all those kind of topics. And so one of the things that we've been looking at in Knowledge Enterprise is how do we give researchers guidance about, you know, data in a way that is focused on the research. And I made the recommendation that if we try and go back to ASU and change those 4 data classifications and all the knock-on implications on our historical data of trying to do that, we're going to be pushing sand uphill. So what we've got at the moment, and this is also in draft form on our website, is the concept of more of a category of research data as opposed to a classification. And what that category states is we have a thing called regulated data, and regulated data means things like human subjects, health data, sensitive information, student data, so on and so forth. The idea being that we can start to provide this guidance to our colleagues in a way that is very research focused rather than just the generic guidance that maybe the university issues across the organization. Yeah, in terms of liability issues, I think that's a reasonable question to ask. I think one of the things it's worth mentioning, because, you know, people collaborate with colleagues at other institutions, so that's obviously something we've got to consider. And one thing which may not be well known by every researcher at the university is that if there's a formal data sharing agreement required, whether or not that data is coming into the university from a third party or going out to a third party, as researchers, we are not permitted to sign that agreement. There's a contracts and negotiations team that signs that agreement. And they're the ones that look at all the legal implications and the liabilities associated with doing that.
Okay.
I think the problem we have with respect to abuse of data is, I mean, if I give you HIPAA as an example, you know, HIPAA is the Health Information Portability Act, so it relates specifically to a certain type of health data that comes under a covered entity. And the way they look at the protections with respect to that is they fall into 3 categories. There's the logical protections, which are the technical ones, like encrypting hard drives and things like that. There's the physical security, you know, like, is your machine in a locked room and how is that handled? And then there's the administrative security. And I think the problem to the comment, I think Mark made the comment, is that at some point we have to trust people to do what they're supposed to do. And ultimately, if they abuse that trust, there's, you know, we're always going to be in a difficult situation. We know our work with tribal communities has fallen into that hole before, where data have been misused. And we're doing our best to walk back from that and create a more productive environment with our tribal community members to make sure that we never fall foul of that again. But yeah, at some point we can only do so much to protect the data physically and logically.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time. We are at 54. I know we'll have a minute or two for some announcements at the end. So any other questions?
Can I just ask, Philip, if you could just revisit the next steps in this process, what we should expect to hear when, and any other opportunities for input?
Okay, sure, yeah. Well, as I say, the implementation timeline has become a little bit compressed because it's taken us longer to to distribute this than I would have liked. Our goal is to get ABOR's approval to implement this in the new year, but obviously that's the implementation of the policy, not everything that goes beyond it. We do have all the comments that have so far been received by the surveys. One or two groups have also sent us additional documentation, which we're happy to process. All of those comments are now on the RDM website. The link to that is in the presentation, which I will share a PDF copy of that so you can find it. You can go and see what those comments are, and you'll recognize some of them because there'll be some of the same concerns that you've got. So our goal now is to digest all those comments to see what we can accommodate within the policy versus what falls into the implementation process and infrastructure box, you know, in terms of how we enact the policy. And really that would be our next steps, to probably issue a final, what we hope to be a final version of, you know, version 1 of the policy, if you like. And of course, policies can be updated as well to accommodate changing requirements. So that's what I would hope would be our next step, would be the opportunity for people to see another version of this with any serious concerns addressed.
So, final question, is it okay for us to send you some feedback even at
Yes, yes, please do. Yeah, as I say, we're trying to be as transparent as possible. All that feedback is going onto the website. We obviously need to digest it and work through it. Plus, anybody who sees this recording who wasn't able to attend the meeting and has additional questions is very welcome to email me directly. My email is on that presentation as well, which I'll share with you. And certainly, you know, this is part of a dialogue. We're not aiming to ramroad anybody. Railroad, I think, is the term, actually. Sorry, that's my Englishness coming through. But, you know, the goal is to take your concerns seriously. I think I understand a lot of them. I may not understand all of them, but certainly we'll do our best to make sure that the policy reflects that, and then ultimately any processes and infrastructure we put in place accommodate it.
Thank you, Phil, very much again. This was really short notice, reaching out to you and taking time to talk with us this Friday. Mark and I are sort of putting together some sort of collective notes from the college leadership. We have encouraged each of our faculty members and doctoral students to submit their feedback as well, because, you know, they should speak for themselves. But on behalf of the college, we are also going to submit some notes. But this is incredibly helpful, and really appreciate both your time and your openness to this conversation.
No worries at all. I apologize, Punya, because I've been asked to attend the ADR meeting next week, so you'll see those slides again.
No, actually, I'm not going to be there. I'm traveling. So Betty's.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
I'll see them. Good. That'll be great. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Before we announcements.
I think just know just an hour next Friday. We'll see you in 2 weeks, hopefully, for our celebration of Global Ed Week. And anything else you want to emphasize, Punya?
No, I mean, since they're still open to getting feedback, I really think that all of us should take a few minutes, skim that policy, put your concerns in there, because as Carla and I were sort of back channeling, this has significant implications for every piece that we do. And I love the fact that Philip was open to this feedback. I don't think that, you know, when people at that level are making these policy decisions, coming from examples in health or economics and so on, truly understand the kind of work that college hours do, which is interacting with groups and organizations in the community and otherwise, which may be very sensitive. You know, and I think just, you know, even the policy, the fact that there is ambiguity in the policy, whether this is about all the data that you've ever done versus the one that's published, I think that clarification took a lot of weight off my mind. You know, if I'm going to have to, like, every interview that is transcribed has to be uploaded and tagged and so on, that's crazy, right? But I think we are all on board with respect to that our research needs to be more transparent, that people should be able to see how we came to the conclusions we did. But again, it has to be balanced against, you know, how many hoops does it add to our lives, right? And so I really recommend, and so thank you all of you for coming today. But again, if you haven't had a chance to put your feedback in, go ahead and do that, because this is a chance to put our thoughts out there. The college leadership also met, and we have created a Google Doc with all our concerns. So Mark and I are sort of putting our heads together in crafting that into a somewhat coherent document. And then we'll be sharing that with Phil and others on the team as well. But again, thank you for taking time this Friday. It's 1 o'clock and we promised just an hour. So with that, see you in 2 weeks.